Today we're standing up for the American worker, and we are finally putting America first.
U.S. President Donald Trump introduces sweeping new tariffs on all imported goods to the United States and reciprocal tariffs on some 60 countries. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In what's being described as Liberation Day for the United States economy, U.S. President Trump moves forward with sweeping new tariffs on dozens of countries, including China, the European Union, and Vietnam. President Trump says the move will bring back manufacturing jobs to the United States. We begin our coverage with this report from CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King in Washington, D.C.
So the debate was as whether Donald Trump would impose a around the world flat tariff or do these reciprocal tariffs. Essentially, the US says this is what you charge US goods to be imported into your country. This is what we're going to charge you to come into our country. He's essentially done a little bit of both. What he's done is said, look, there's a flat import tax now tariff of 10%. And then the US Trade Representative came out with this list of numbers, trying to work out exactly how much the US is charged for goods elsewhere, taking that number and halving it. For example, it's come up with, and these numbers will be challenged, China has 67% import duties, so they're going to be charging them 34%. Japan has 46%, so they'll be charging them 24%. The tariff for South Korea works out 25%. This is a huge change, something that will be felt by every nation that trades with the US. I mean, I encourage you to look at these tables. Look up countries like Botswana, Lesotho. A lot of these countries don't have a lot of exports, but they're going to be hit extremely hard on what they do to the US. Essentially, it's a global league table of tariffs. Now, how can countries get out from this? The president says it's simple. Invest in America. If you want to sell things in America, make them in America for American customers. But what about inputs that come from all around the world? We know it's not easy to change a global system. We saw it during the pandemic, and decoupling could take a long time and could be impossible for some industries. The other way out might be to lower your tariffs to an extent where the administration is happy enough for you to escape them, or, of course, come to a bilateral trade deal with the United States, all of which could be done, but there is no yet clear path. But what we do know is this is the biggest changing to the global trading system in decades, and everyone's going to feel it. Nathan King, CGTN at the White House.
For more now on the U.S. tariffs, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Brussels is Pieter Cleppe. He's the editor-in-chief of the online publication Brussels-Report.eu. Also with us, Laura Carlsen is the executive director of Mira, a Mexico City-based international relations think tank. From British Columbia, Gordon Houlden is a former Canadian diplomat and director emeritus of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. And Zhou is a senior researcher with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. He joins us from Beijing. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Zhou, let me start with you. So President Trump announced this range of tariffs on Wednesday on imports from a wide array of countries around the world. Something like 60 countries will be affected. He was doing this, he said, to save the U.S. industrial base and bring back jobs. Let's listen to a little bit more of what he had to say.
Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. We will supercharge our domestic industrial base. We will pry open foreign markets and break down foreign trade barriers. And ultimately, more production at home will mean stronger competition and lower prices for consumers. This will be indeed the golden age of America. It's coming back. We're going to come back very strongly.
So, Zhou, let's look at some of the specifics here. Trump will impose what he calls a 10% baseline tax. That's on all imported goods coming into the United States. There will be a 25% tariff on imported automobiles. Now, China is one of the biggest trading partners with the United States. Its exporters face additional tariffs of 34%, but that doesn't tell you the whole picture because there were existing tariffs of 20%. So we're talking effectively 54% tariffs against China. So what does it mean for China, and how will the Chinese government respond to this?
Well, if you're looking at tariff rate, I think it's maybe it's still very high because we are looking at especially for the companies when they have to make the decisions on import or export. I think that they have to very carefully calculate all the digits about the tariffs. So if they want to import from China, I think that the retailers are really thinking about 1% or 2%. Are there really matters for the people, because the profits, maybe the margins are not that big. But if you're looking back in the past 7 or 8 years, we can see that tariffs already brought a lot of pressures for the import of United States consumers, and that is not just be burdened by Chinese suppliers. I mean, most of retailers and wholesalers of United States are also taking responsibility for the increased cost. As for the Chinese government, I don't think that I can just speak for them, but in my personal opinion, I would say that we have a lot of principles, and one of them, we stick to the principle of the mutual benefit. And I don't believe that we are trying to just stay there and waiting for everything to be unfair, because it's not only about the tariff itself, it is about the rules. Can we just make the commitment about what we have promised in the WTO or in other free trade agreements like the United States has with the South Korea? I think that the principles are even more important than just the tariff itself. So we should try to think about what we can do to deal with this kind of a new situation. I don't think that is only China suffered from that, but as the biggest, one of the biggest trade partners of the United States, we have to try to do something to reduce uncertainties, because that is definitely not good for both sides.
Right, certainly. There's something like 60 countries around the world that are being affected. Laura Carlsen, good to see you. Now, since taking office for this second term, President Trump has imposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada. He increased tariffs on steel and aluminium to 25%. And this week he announced a 25% tariff on finished vehicles. That's from Mexico. At that time when that was announced, this was the response from the Mexican President, Claudia Sheinbaum. Let's listen.
We do not believe in an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, because that always leads to a bad situation. Of course, measures are taken because measures are taken on the other side, but the dialogue must continue. It's not about tit for tat, but about what is best for Mexico and how to face the situation.
So, Laura, here we have Mexico, also one of the biggest trade partners with the United States. And what we hear from President Sheinbaum, she's being very pragmatic. She's not talking about tit-for-tat tariffs. She's expected to announce a comprehensive response on Thursday. What are expectations in Mexico?
Well, you can tell that President Sheinbaum is walking a fine line there, and with good reason, because of the extremely high degree of dependency of the Mexican economy on the U.S. economy. When this began with the tariff threats, she was bolder. She talked about retaliatory tariffs, and now she's refusing to talk about that. We'll see what the broader plan looks like tomorrow. But essentially what she's saying is that we will continue with Plan Mexico, which is the Mexican economic policy. It includes some measures that give Mexico a slightly higher degree of protection from these kinds of tariffs, and basically what many consider the weaponization of economic policy in the United States, including promoting internal consumption and becoming more self-sufficient in certain, especially strategic products. Those are all pretty long-term goals, though. So she's been forming a common front with the major business leaders within the country, and so far they're supporting her to try to come up with a position to confront these tariffs. And but basically, it's extremely difficult. We're really looking with these very high levels of tariffs at the opening shot of a global trade war, and that will have a tremendous impact on Mexico. Mexico and Canada were not on the list of countries that President Trump presented in the Rose Garden today. It's been said that because he already imposed certain types of tariffs on them, that they would not be subject, at least immediately, to these reciprocal tariffs. But then just today, adding beer and aluminum cans was a huge blow because Mexico is such a huge exporter of beer to the United States. And there still may be more tariffs that have to do with sector by sector products. So it's not clear how they're going to respond. They say they have worked out several different scenarios. And like the president said, there'll be a fuller explanation tomorrow. But Mexico's in a vulnerable position.
Right, Laura, just to clarify something, the fact that Mexico and Canada were not on that list, is this because of their membership with the United States, of course, in the USMCA, which used to be known as NAFTA, of course? Does that agreement actually protect these countries, relatively speaking?
Well, in part, when there was a threat last month to impose a 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, they did dodge that bullet by finally negotiating that products that were under the U.S.-Mexico Free Trade Agreement would not be subject to it, and then supposedly getting some concessions from those governments. But you can no longer expect that free trade agreements will be honored. What's happening today is a unilateral action that breaks all kinds of world trade rules. And so I don't think that anyone thinks that they're protected from what could happen next from this Trump administration.
Okay, Gordon Houlden, the United States has partially imposed a 25% blanket tariff on imports from Canada. There is also a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminium. Now Trump is going after Canadian passenger vehicles as well as automobile parts. And of course, automobiles, as we know, if we look at Mexico, Canada, and the United States, it's a huge supply chain. The Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has responded to some of this. That was before today's announcement. This is what he had to say. Let's watch.
President Trump is in the process of trying to fundamentally restructure the U.S. economy, and that means that our economy here needs to change dramatically as well. And as I made clear to President Trump in our call last week, I will reject all attempts to weaken Canada, all attempts to wear us down, to break us down, so that America can own us.
So Prime Minister Mark Carney being very clear there about the threat that Canada faces, saying that Canada has to change its own economy right now. Canada has already imposed a 25% tariff on its exports. So what are the options that Canada has right now?
I think part of the problem is that in the case of Canada, Trump's threats have not just been economic measures, tariffs, but combined with threats to make Canada the 51st state. So I think this has galvanized the Canadian people, actually during an election campaign. And this will mean, as the Prime Minister has indicated, that there will be counter tariffs. It's true that for some of the USMCA goods, we haven't been hit at this time. But even the existing tariffs, for example, the auto tariffs start tonight, 25%. That's roughly 4 times the profit margin of the companies that are producing automobiles across our borders. So that is immediately uneconomic. And I'm skeptical that that can be fixed in a matter of months or years. This is a hard blow to automobile producers in the United States, in Canada, and Mexico. So that is one of the problems. The second is that another key export, lumber, for example, already is heavily tariffed. Steel and aluminum, we are responsible, Canada, for 70% of the aluminum imports by the United States. This crosses the whole range of industrial production. So at the same time that Trump is talking about a new bloom in U.S. industrial production, he's raising the cost of the inputs, which I believe will make it more difficult for U.S. manufacturers to compete with other manufacturers around the world. Overall, it feels like Trump is pouring sand in the machinery of international trade, which will slow down the global economy. Individual countries may be hit more or less, but the overall global economy, I believe, will be slowed by this, in effect, nascent trade war.
Right, and Gordon, you mentioned the Canadian election. That's a snap election, which has been called. That'll take place later this month. How big an issue is this in the election campaign?
I think it'd almost be safe to say this is issue 1, 2, and 3. It occupies almost all of the oxygen, with other issues relegated, were in the forefront, relegated to the sidelines. Canadians are angry. They are boycotting, consumers are boycotting American goods. And the question of how to deal with Trump and the tariff threat and these regularly repeated comments about the 51st state, that is the dominant issue for all of the parties in this election, which will terminate at the end of this month.
Pieter Cleppe, there is also deep concern in Europe over these tariffs that were announced and previous tariffs that were announced by the United States President, the European Union Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. She said she is disheartened by the tariffs. Let's listen to her.
This is the largest and most prosperous trade relation worldwide. We would all be better off if we could find a constructive solution. At the same time, it also has to be clear. Europe has not started this confrontation. We do not necessarily want to retaliate, but if it is necessary, we have a strong plan to retaliate and we will use it.
So, Pieter, even before today's measures were announced, Trump had imposed a 20% tariff on all EU imports into the United States. Von der Leyen says, as we heard there, that Europe is in a position to push back. But I'm wondering, what are the options that Europe has? Because, there's a very low growth forecast for Europe for 2025. The EU has said it will impose tariffs on $28 billion worth of goods imported from the United States. How is this going to affect Europe, its growth, and, of course, European consumers?
Well, frankly, Europe doesn't have all that much leverage. It has a trade surplus in goods. So, of course, that also means that if this trade war heats up, eventually Europe has more to lose, or at least Europe's exporters. There's talk about hitting American services, but that would also damage Europe economically, simply because those American services are so dominant for a reason. Often IT services that are superior to the alternatives on the market. What's more, Trump has the upper hand when it comes to the dominance in terms of defense and the importance of defense for Europe and the American role in that. And last but not least, European nations are also quite divided. I mean, we could hear Ms. von der Leyen speak so boldly, but the truth is that countries like France and Italy are less than prepared to see their exports of, for example, their alcoholic drinks to the United States being constrained by tariffs.
And Pieter, you talked about services there. Of course, the United States runs a surplus, something like $300 billion when it comes to services, those things that you talk about. And they're mainly things like digital services, cloud computing, for instance, or some of the big IT companies that are operating in Europe. The EU has already taken action against these companies. Could we see more of that?
Well, if the trade war heats up, yes, everything is on the table. The EU has even spread rumors that it may undermine IP rights, that it may, for example, allow Europeans to watch Netflix for free. So this will, of course, be very unwise. I think European countries and governments have to keep their heads cool. If you look at the reasons why Trump has been elected, yes, it is true that he has announced these kind of tariffs in his program, even if he was never too clear that they would be so extreme. But I think, frankly, he doesn't have a mandate to do what he's currently doing. We see the markets acting very negatively, and this is not the only factor at play, but I think there's going to be some kind of a backlash. He just lost an election in Wisconsin as well. So I don't think things are looking as rosy. So if you ask me, the best thing that Europe can do is to be constructive and to say, look, it's true, we are protectionist to a degree, but we're willing to talk and to offer you something in return for not going through with all of this.
Gordon, President Trump has also warned Canada and the European Union, warned them against joining forces in what could be a trade war, what will most likely be a trade war. How is that kind of warning being received in Canada?
Well, I think in the general chaos of Trump pronouncements, it's largely been noted only by a handful of observers, but it is troubling. The extraterritorial pressure from the United States on ranges between two-third countries is almost unprecedented. And already our Prime Minister has been to Europe, been to France, been to England to discuss how we might strengthen our economic ties. What Trump is threatening, saying, if you, Canada, start working with your European partners to improve your trade, I will sanction you even more. I think he's getting a little bit out on a limb there, his ability to do that, to actually successfully do that. But this is a president who, in theory at least, can't be reelected. He may not care as much as we might think about public opinion. He is stubborn and may simply press ahead.
Zhou, Chinese companies have managed to keep the flow of goods into the United States, and that's by manufacturing in places like Mexico. I mean, China has invested billions of dollars setting up factories in Mexico. They manufacture a whole host of things, from auto parts, electronics, appliances, among other things. Now, President Trump says he wants to close. He sees that as a loophole, and he says he wants to close that loophole. How will that affect Chinese exporters, manufacturers?
Well, it's not only about Mexico. I think that Chinese companies are making a lot of investment abroad in the recent years. So I think that is possible because the Chinese companies are getting stronger. So we do not have the reason to question that it is just for the US market. Although US market is a very important one, but it's not the only one in the world. We are seeing there are so many possibilities for encouraging the companies to grasp. So I would say that for, if you're looking at average tariffs after Trump declared the reciprocal tariff, it has reached the 29% average. It's even higher than the 1930s. So I would say that we are trying to improve the diversification along this Belt and Road region, or trying to cooperate more companies to improve the capabilities and the profits.
Right, Laura, we hear a lot of numbers when we talk about tariffs and the impending trade war. We hear a lot about policies as well, but these have, real effects on manufacturers and producers and on consumers, of course. I was looking at some figures here. The United States receives 51% of its fresh fruit and 69% of its fresh vegetables from Mexico. That was the numbers for 2022. With these, how will these tariffs affect Mexican farmers?
Well, it's not exactly clear yet, because probably the biggest reaction will not even be from the farmers, but the most important one politically also will be from the U.S. consumers, because there's no question whatsoever that these tariffs will raise prices on some basic goods, or what have become basic goods like avocados, to U.S. consumers. And there's likely to be an outcry about that because inflation has been always such a touchstone issue in U.S. politics. For farmers, it could definitely devastate a number of industries that rely on export, like avocados, which I mentioned. I don't think we've seen, because we didn't know until today exactly, a detailed scenario of what's to happen, but it could have a very, very serious impact. They're trying to get more internal consumption. They're trying to look for other markets, but for now, they're in a very bad situation with these tariffs.
Right, Peter. I've just got a little bit of time left. I want to get to a few other things. One is, Germany's economy, for instance, and we look at the German auto industry, one of the biggest sectors in the German economy. What kind of impact is this going to have on the auto industry in Germany? And one other figure I was looking at is the economy in Germany is expected to grow only by 0.2% this year.
Well, ING Bank, they made a simulation of the damage that all of this would do to the European economy, and I think they were at 0.3% of GDP per year. But they thereby pointed out that because of the cumulative effect over years, that actually will, amount to quite a lot of economic damage. And as you say, then specific sectors like the already struggling German car industry are, of course, going to suffer quite a lot more than other sectors that are not as dependent on the U.S. market.
Gordon, there are some analysts who see these tariffs that are being imposed by President Trump as short-term tactics to force concessions from trade partners, that in time, and probably in a very short space of time, that they will be reversed. Do you believe that to be the case?
I hope that to be the case. To be quite honest, predicting Trump's behavior into the future is a very difficult task. If he does receive the amount of pressure domestically from industry and from consumers, there may be an irresistible pressure on him to back down and to negotiate individually. However, the damage has been done to some extent already. Many exporters, not just from Canada, from other countries, have paused exports because the importers are afraid of the tariff they might have to pay. The simple uncertainty saps consumer confidence and business confidence. If he does move quickly to negotiate and negotiate downward, the damage will be real, but manageable. If he sticks to his guns and perhaps even adds tariffs, as he occasionally threatened to do, he hasn't said he's finished, then I think we're going to see definitely a slowing of the global economy with ill effects for all.
Zhou, very quickly, I've got less than a minute. What kind of impact is all of this going to have on the global economy, on growth in the global economy?
I think it's definitely will depend the potentials of the development possibilities, but I would say that the reconstruction of the supply chain will happen also at the same time. So many countries are trying to think about the possibilities of doing business, not only trying to include the United States markets.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.
Thanks, Phil.